listening to Community Forum on KCCC 930 AM, sponsored by Eddy County, honoring God, country, and family, thriving with industry since 1889.
Thank you for listening to Community Forum. My name is Johnny Chandler, the owner of KCCC 930 AM and the host of Community Forum. With me for part two in studio is Paul Gessing. Paul Gessing is the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Well, I was going to say welcome back, but we only took about a 30-second break between recording part one and part two, just so the listeners know both these episodes were recorded at the same time on the same day. So at the end of the first one, we talked a lot about the primary elections. We talked about what I think you called the wartime surplus, right? Mm-hmm. The Iran war surplus, which was an extra $850 million. We also talked about Mackenzie Bishop and Abrazo Homes and some of the upcoming episodes that you have on tippingpointnm.com. One is with Mackenzie Bishop on Abrazo Homes. The second one was with another gentleman. I don't remember his name, but he's a cigar shop owner that was moving to Texas because he needs a business-friendly environment to live in. And then Carol Wright, who's the CEO of the Restaurant Association, is retiring and moving to Arizona. And then you also mentioned that with the idea of Deb Haaland governorship and these policies that aren't beneficial for business owners probably aren't going to get any better. You mentioned something about an escape plan as well.
Yeah, I think everybody, especially business owners and folks who are concerned about what she could do. And one of the big questions is what she can or will do on the energy front, because we know that she has that kind of anti-energy perspective. I'll tell you a brief story. So one of my best friends in the world is the San Juan County manager. So way up in Farmington, he is the manager of that county. And he was talking to let's say a moderate legislator who, on the Democratic side, who does not like the replacement of moderate Democrats with progressives, because she happens to be a moderate Democrat. And he was asking her about the energy issue, and she said, Deb Haaland is a true believer on energy. Now, what does that mean? That means that she will likely try or is looking for ways to hobble the oil and gas industry. What does that mean? I don't know, because the land commissioner is part of that. The federal government is a big part of that. So it's going to be an interesting thing if indeed she gets elected to see what she can and will do. But I just can say that it's not going to be what we want her to do if she does things. It's going to be troubling.
I've always heard, so first, for two questions for you. One, does Paul Gessing have an escape plan?
I have the makings of a plan. It's tough when you have three kids and they're all in schools and stuff. I've decided that, we have a general plan. My wife is in sales, and sales is notoriously a hard business to have that kind of plan with. Of course, part of that sales is she sells to the state a lot. So with the state government growing and having plenty of money, it is something that has benefited her and our family directly. But I have opportunities and thoughts about what would happen if Deb Haaland really comes in like a wrecking ball and starts messing the state up in a way that affects my family. I've got thoughts and ideas about that.
So my second question, maybe a statement, which will lead to a question or definitely something that you'll be able to answer, is I've always kind of heard the adage or work on the idea that when you're campaigning, you're all oil and gas industry bad, right? And then, especially if you're a Democrat or a progressive Democrat, right? Mm-hmm. You believe wholeheartedly in climate change if you're of that mindset, right? So then you get into Santa Fe and you look at the budget and you're like, it's not really all that bad, right? Because if you want to grow the government, as some politicians do and some governors do, and you want to expand the services the government offers, you need that money. Like universal child care does not happen without oil and gas revenues, right? So do you see that type of situation if Deb Haaland wins as governor?
I do think a dose of reality is going to face her, as it did in the Biden administration. Biden came in hot and heavy with a lot of pretty radical policies, anti-energy, that she was supposed to carry out, and that was pushed back upon. And part of it, the thing is that a lot of politicians, both political parties, come into a position and they think that everybody in government, every rule, every regulation, every law suddenly bows down to them. And the reality is that there are three branches of government. It's why the founding fathers created the system that we have. And so just speaking into the oil and gas arena, we mentioned the federal government and their role in the fact that they control a lot of the lands, the BLM specifically, but also the land commissioner. And there's going to be a very competitive land commissioner race, and they're going to have a leg to stand on potentially up against this governor, whoever the governor is. So it's not as easy just from a structural perspective to really wreak havoc one way or the other. And that can be in a positive direction in terms of taxes and reform. Although, let's transition to this. Free childcare. We just talked about that. There's legal issues around that, and I believe those are justified. And this gets into, and we've seen it in Washington as well during especially this administration, but also the last one. But there are ways that the executive have continued to take power from the legislative bodies. And in this case specifically, free childcare. The governor did not campaign, this Lujan Grisham did not campaign on free childcare. It was never part of her agenda that she expressed at any time publicly. Paid family leave died in the session before, and then she comes out in the summer of last year in 2025 and says, everybody, we're going to do free childcare. And we all looked at each other like, where the heck is this coming from? And then she not only says that, but she doesn't have a special session to pass this thing. She does it by herself. On November 1st, the program takes effect. The first judge in the appeals process, and again, Tipping Point, New Mexico, I've got a fascinating, I really recommend the interview with Jacob Candelaria. He's a former state senator, a very progressive individual who was the lead sponsor of the Energy Transition Act. Now he's the lead attorney in support of overturning the free childcare. And he's a very, very smart guy, very well spoken. But he and I on the show talked about some of the issues with free childcare. Obviously, there's constitutional questions because the legislature, that body is supposed to make the laws that we live under here in New Mexico. And the governor usurped that completely, illegitimately, in my estimation. Now, a appeals court judge recently said, hey, that's okay. This is going to the Supreme Court. We'll see how it goes. But if you allow one governor to create by themselves, an entitlement program that's going to cost an estimated $850 million a year, it's really hard to see how there are limits realistically placed on the executive branch. So that court case could have profound implications for a Deb Haaland administration down the road on a whole array of issues. So it's a huge problem that we're seeing.
Right. And our Democrat-controlled legislature, if we have a Republican governor, gives the Republican governor a lot of freedom as well if the state Supreme Court upholds the way that Michelle Lujan Grisham went forward with universal child care.
Yeah, I told a Albuquerque radio host, I said, if this was in effect during the Gary Johnson administration, Gary being pretty libertarian-minded, he could have just said, well, we're no longer collecting the personal income tax. I'm making an executive decision. We're not doing that. The state's going to have to survive without the income tax because I'm a libertarian and I can do this by myself. Well, A, that would never happen because nobody would go along with it. And B, it would have been illegal. But the illegal aspect is the thing that we're going to be tested on here in the courts.
Yeah, the due process is important.
Yeah,
right.
You have
Absolutely.
to have the process in place. And again, I have some of my same complaints. We're not going to get into it about the Trump administration, and the courts have attempted to hold him to account. New Mexico's courts operate a lot differently than the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal court system, but hopefully the New Mexico Supreme Court in this case will stand up for the rule of law. And yeah, if Deb Haaland gets elected, the legislature will likely go along with it and reintroduce and pass a free child care program.
And then it's law through due process, and then
exactly.
That's the state you choose to live in.
Exactly.
Right? Absolutely. All right, let's transition to the Albuquerque City Council and the city of Albuquerque raising or attempting to raise gross receipts tax yet again. I know this is probably not very relevant to individuals that live down here. I did live in Albuquerque for 20 years. My family still lives in Albuquerque, so I always pay very much attention to it. So tell us a little bit about what happened in that regards, as well as what those broader implications for the state would mean, if there is any implications to the state on the idea that raising gross receipts tax.
Well, I'll say this, and this is more of like a political thing in the sense that oftentimes it seems like you're going to get a loss. And if you organize and get your people out and advocate, you can actually turn that potential loss into a win. So this all surrounds a swimming pool in the Northeast Heights of Albuquerque that one particular ostensibly Republican city councilor really, really wants. The price tag on that thing's gone from $17 to $70 million. And they've added some bells and whistles, but no public works project should go from $17 to $70 million. And the kicker is that rather than floating a small bond or something to pay off the $36 million that still needs to be paid in, this counselor wanted to put a nearly half a cent gross receipts tax add-on into Albuquerque. And that affects everybody in the state because a lot of people do a lot of their, kind of heavy duty annual shopping trips to Albuquerque. They're going to pay a lot higher tax if this passed. But the kicker is this was going to raise $113 million immediately for a $36 million issue. And everybody's dealing with affordability, all kinds of issues. So we worked with a local grassroots organization. I would encourage folks to sign up for their emails to find out how to engage in the political process, a group called Americans for Prosperity. They're a national organization with a New Mexico chapter. And I worked with them to train activists to get out to city council, and they helped. We had 32 folks from that organization at city council on Monday night in Albuquerque, which if you have 32 people on one issue, that is a good turnout. And it almost never happens, at least in this state, with a few exceptions, whether you're talking legislature or local political issues. And essentially, we had city councilors on our side saying that we were going to lose going into that meeting. But I think the council realized that people are not happy right now with the unaffordability, with the idea that we're going to raise taxes while people are struggling. And so it wound up losing out on a 5-4 vote. Now, this was to put it on the ballot, but even that, they said, no, we're not going to do that. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues I'd like to have discussed on ballots that we never get to talk about, like eliminating the income tax or something else at the state level. But
what about minimum wage?
Yeah, the minimum wage in Albuquerque is going up. They were able to renegotiate that down to a 3-year phase-in of $1 increase in Albuquerque a year. It's kind of interesting because currently the state rate is $12 an hour. Now, when that was passed, it looked like a very big deal. But then we've had this inflation go on for the last several years. And while I don't like inflation and I don't like government mandated wage rates, the fact that inflation went up at the same time as this wage rate kind of mitigated against, I think, the worst impacts of a $12 an hour wage. But within 3 years, Albuquerque will be at $15 an hour, and it will be indexed to the rate of inflation or CPI.
So I wanted to ask a question about inflation CPI.
Sure.
So there's been other municipalities, I think the city of Santa Fe has done this, to where the minimum wage was raised to a certain level and then related to an inflation and CPI after that, right?
Yeah.
So every year, if inflation goes up. But if we hit a recession and a bunch of stuff drops, it doesn't go down.
Right.
Right. It only has the ability to go up. So when you tie it to the rate of inflation and then consumer price index, and then that it goes up, but there could be years, hypothetical scenario, especially after major events. COVID would be one of them. 9/11 was certainly one of them, right? To where things like kind of drop and hit rock bottom, right? Their wage doesn't go down related to the same type of index. So is there a fairness, to put that index there, but it can never go down as a result?
It's not just unfair. It is a mathematical game that I would say that the advocates are playing, because CPI, consumer price index, inflation, is a fairly steady number. Yes, there's a few times we've seen, especially post-COVID during the Biden administration, when it spiked, and that you have to deal with it. But apartment rentals is the thing that Santa Fe was combining and did combine with their minimum wage, but that Albuquerque was also considering that they wound up not adopting. And why is that an issue? Well, you mentioned the fact that CPI and the whole inflation calculation under the law would never go down. But apartment price calculations are going to be much more volatile than the US CPI index. And so what does that create? Well, if you combine those numbers, you create a situation where some years you'll see a spike, but you'll never see a drop if apartment prices go down. And Santa Fe in particular, if you've been up there south of town, there are apartments going up left and right, and those will, I believe, have a positive impact on apartment prices in the city of Santa Fe. Albuquerque hasn't done quite as much, but the point being that by driving the volatility of that index up, it drives the price up and it drives the mandated wage up. And yeah, it would cause real problems for Albuquerque businesses, and it will soon cause real problems for Santa Fe. Although Santa Fe, they're able to get by because they are considered a world-class tourism destination. So you have a lot of rich people that come there who are not very affected. But again, the people who will be affected are the lower wage earners in Santa Fe. And Santa Fe, I hate to say this, but Santa Fe is a lot like a third world country. You have the extreme wealth and the people who make their money elsewhere and don't really care about what happens to the middle and lower classes. And then you have a lot of lower class working poor people in Santa Fe who are just struggling to get by. And you never hear much about from them unless some crimes committed or something happens in one of those areas of town. It's kind of a tough situation.
I feel like California is just like Santa Fe. California is like a haves and have-not state.
Yes.
If I was just there, so it was real glaring, And Santa Fe is very much like California, and the super rich have their lifestyle, and then everybody else just gets kind of scraped by if they choose to live there.
Yeah, I would say the big difference is that California does have still a true economy in the way that Santa Fe is reliant on art and tourism and kind of government money. California still has the technology sector. It still has various major businesses, although it's bleeding them on the daily because the policy climate and the taxes have gotten out of control up there.
Well, if you don't like ordering from kiosks or self-checkouts and you're in Albuquerque, then just get used to more and more of them.
Yeah, and the $20 an hour minimum wage has driven that in California for fast food workers. They adopted that, I think, a year or so ago. And we relied on a study that was produced by the University of California at Santa Cruz. And the author of that report said the very basic, common sense things that increasing minimum wages leads to three basic outcomes. It leads to price increases. It leads to the non-hiring, and it leads to automation. So people don't get hired as much, and automation. And kind of the automation and the lack of hiring are two sides of the same coin. But more so, if businesses see that really high minimum wage, and it is a government-mandated wage, then they just may not even come there.
Right. No, I agree. So let's in part one, you mentioned something about data centers, and that's got me thinking that I don't think you and I have discussed data centers. I don't think we've discussed Project Jupiter. Mm-hmm. Project Jupiter should be on everybody's brain because they are advertising statewide heavily.
They are.
Right. And
including Spanish language ads full page in the Albuquerque Journal, which I think is a little bit odd because the Albuquerque Journal is an English publication, and you're not going to just, I'm speaking Spanish, therefore I'm going to read this ad in the Journal that has nothing else for me. But hey.
Right. Well, so if you are somebody that accepts advertising dollars to keep your business afloat, you're not disappointed in what Project Jupiter's doing by any means, especially a full page ad. But I don't know if we've ever talked about the Rio Grande Foundation's position on data centers. I know that, and I preface this because there seems to be, at least in some headlines, starting to be some community pushback on data centers, more of a NIMBY, not my backyard type situation, right? And I know we have Facebook, which was our first big data center here in the state of New Mexico. This is going to be a large data center in Doñana County. And then I know that Lee County is getting one, and I think there's some discussions here of Eddy County as well. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on, not you personally, right, the Rio Grande Foundation's thoughts on data centers and the explosion of them.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of things. One, I jokingly talked to somebody who works with the data centers kind of as a lobbyist, and I said, well, you should take an easier job working in big tobacco or something, because they're more popular these days than a lot of the data centers. On the flip side, we have no problem with data centers as a entity, as a business that we should be attracting to New Mexico. And New Mexico is an attractive destination with a few major challenges for data centers. Why are we attractive? Well, we don't get hurricanes, we don't get tornadoes, and we don't get floods or earthquakes. Typically, there some minor ones, but generally, infrastructure can survive the New Mexico earthquakes, unlike the Cal Northridge earthquake or some other places where it's much more volatile. So we have a lot going for us in New Mexico, plus the wide open spaces. Now, what are the challenges for the data centers? Well, two are real challenges. One is just politics, and New Mexico. I'll start with the politics. Generally speaking, this is a area where people don't like change. They don't like new developments. Private sector is scary. All of those things. Now, that's not unique to New Mexico. We're seeing this all across the country, but that's just a reality. So, secondly, energy. Thirdly, water. Now, in 2025, the legislature did something that, shockingly for the folks up in Santa Fe, because I criticize them all the time and they deserve it, but they did something far-sighted and very smart. In 2025, so not 26, not the last session, the previous 60-day, they adopted a microgrid bill. Basically, they said the data centers that are coming here can set up their own off-the-grid electricity generation to power those particular facilities. Now, that is we can argue whether it's in conflict. I think ultimately it will be, but it is rubbing against, shall we say, aggressively the Energy Transition Act, which is trying to get New Mexico 100% wind and solar. You can't really do these data centers, in my opinion, without traditional energy sources. Primarily, currently, that's going to be natural gas. Down the road, that could be nuclear, which to me solves all the problems, but that's not necessarily the case for a lot of New Mexicans who have, I think, unfounded concerns about using those nuclear power plants to power those data centers with no CO2 emissions. The water is the other issue. And of course, we just talked about the drought and the lack of water around New Mexico. Of course, this is a desert state. We all know the water is very precious in New Mexico. But playing into Southeast New Mexico's favor yet again, the oil and gas industry, when you drill for oil and gas, you tend to get what they call produced water out of the ground. And that water currently tends to be just re-injected back into the ground, disposed of. Now, it's contaminated water. It's ancient water. We got the oil and gas in the first place because New Mexico was under an ancient ocean with dinosaurs, and we're dealing with dinosaur, remains that turned into oil and gas. I'm being very simplistic here, but you get the impression. That water does come out of the ground, and that water, the people pushing not just the data centers, but reuse of that water, treated water, are really, I think, doing the Lord's work, trying to get essentially New Mexico out of the desert mindset and into a mindset where water may not be plentiful, but we have water to do what we need to do with it. And the data centers will not use all that water. The data centers are much more efficient than that. They use closed loops that, essentially the water's needed to cool those facilities. There's other technologies, but water's still the best and the easiest, and you can just circulate it through. So you're not using massive amounts of water every year to get these facilities cooled. And I think, there's a lot to be said for allowing those data centers to happen. Now, Project Jupiter is on its way to completion. It's being built right now. There's other data centers here in southeast New Mexico. You mentioned Facebook in Los Lunas. There was one in Socorro that, quite frankly, I thought they were selling a pig in a poke. I just don't think it was a realistic data center. They were talking about wind and solar and all of these so-called green technologies. I just don't think that was realistic. And quite frankly, a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant, and preferably a nuclear plant, is more green and better for the environment than covering thousands and thousands of acres of desert with solar panels or wind turbines. I mean, there are real negative environmental problems with those massive solar and wind turbine arrays. In fact, as I drove down here, Klein's Corners and
Encino, they've got them.
Yeah, if you've driven up there, as you clearly have, that's part of the SunZia project, which is just, I believe, coming online. Now, I didn't see many of those wind turbines moving, but that is, they have the materials that go into them, the drilling into the ground, the materials, the cement and all that stuff, and then the unsteadiness of the electricity that they produce because the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine, et cetera. You don't have enough power and your grid goes down. That is not something that is acceptable to the data centers. So they need that steady power, and that's the genius of the microgrid law. Now, there's going to be opposition, and Michelle Lujan Grisham, to her credit, has largely been supportive. I don't think we should be handing subsidies and IRBs and other tax favors to these facilities. I think we should ultimately reform them and, make it so businesses are willing to locate here without those kinds of giveaways. But all that being said, I think there's more to like on the data center front than to oppose, but we'll see how this all shakes out. Very controversial issue.
Yeah, and I think obviously the water seems to be one of the bigger issues. I remember, it's probably years ago now, there's some interview with Elon Musk, and somebody's like, "Why are you concerned about all the water?" And he's like, "No, there's the planet's 70% water. There's plenty of water." Right? The issue is getting the water where it needs to go. That's going to get it's expensive.
Yeah, and you need to look no further than the Middle East and the Iran war. We talked a little bit about sporadically through these conversations. Those countries are not surviving. Saudi Arabia, even Israel, are not surviving based on traditional water and groundwater, rivers and underground sources of water. They are dealing with desalination. And that similar process can be used to make that water that comes out of the ground, the produced water, viable not just for data centers. They say it can be turned into essentially distilled water, which is cleaner than clean because it doesn't even have the minerals. And then we can comply with our Texas treaty obligations on water. And generally speaking, that water can be used for a lot of different things. And I know agriculture is having a really tough time right now. Agriculture is an often forgotten about area of the state, but if you're able to do a lot of these more industrial processes and treaty obligations with produced water, you can do more of the agriculture with the existing water supplies, and it frees that up. So this is a real win-win opportunity for the state of New Mexico if we can use that produced water. But who's opposed? The radical environmental groups. Why are they opposed? Well, they generally don't like development. They don't like any new industrial or 21st century technological activity. And so they're more than happy to throw sand in the gears on the data center front. And if we have this produced water, it is a benefit thanks to the oil and gas industry, which already produces money. And this resource that we all use, even if you drive an electric vehicle or take a bus, you're using oil and gas every single day. But the environmentalists want to try to squash that industry as much as they can. And they don't want, heaven forbid, another useful byproduct of the oil and gas industry, this produced water, that would then be treated and used in economically advantageous ways to benefit New Mexicans. They don't like that at all. So I got an email from, I'm on email lists. Wild Earth Guardians, I believe, was the one. They sent out a press release, and they called it fracking water. That's what the name that they came up with, and it's all about messaging. And they tried to freak people out about fracking 10 years ago. Thankfully, they failed, and most people accept that fracking is actually a safe and very important process. data centers, I think, is a little bit of fracking 2.0, and hopefully we can get beyond this and move forward. Doesn't mean that all of them should be moved forward. It doesn't mean that there are not concerns about it, but and whether AI is great for Western civilization is another question that needs to be answered. But we should not, out of hand, dismiss this technology and dismiss these data centers because of the water and energy consumption issues.
All right. Paul Gessing with the Rio Grande Foundation. Go ahead and plug everywhere everybody needs to go to check out what you guys are doing.
Yeah, our most regularly updated site is heirsofenchantment.com, riograndefoundation.org as well. And then all these Tipping Point New Mexico podcasts, you can go to tippingpointnm.com and find us there. You can follow us on Twitter or X at Rio Grande FNDN. My personal account, unfortunately, has been lost to the hackers, but at least temporarily, and they don't seem to have much in the way of customer support for that kind of stuff. But you can still follow us on Twitter at the Rio Grande FNDN, and that's very regularly updated. But yeah, plenty of ways to get a hold of us and check out our content.
All right, sir. Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny.
You're listening to Community Forum on KCCC 930 AM, sponsored by Eddy County, honoring God, country, and family, thriving with industry since 1889.